The courtroom buzzed with the murmur of anticipation, the low hum of whispers weaving a tense melody through the packed room. Faces, young and old, turned toward the defendant's table, where Marcus, a 23-year-old black man, sat frozen. His eyes darted nervously to his attorney, a public defender with too many cases and too little time, fumbling through disorganized notes. Sweat beaded on Marcus' forehead, his hands gripping the edge of the table like a lifeline. The air felt stifling, heavy with the weight of unseen biases. "Order!" Judge Whitman barked, his gavel slamming down with a force that echoed through the room. He was an older man, his pale skin wrinkled like an old road map. His piercing blue eyes radiated an unspoken disdain. Known for his hardline rulings, particularly against young black men, Whitman's presence alone sent a chill down the spine of every person in the room. Marcus' lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a moment to present." "Denied." Whitman interrupted, his tone cold and dismissive. "I've heard enough. This trial has gone on long enough for what should be an open-and-shut case." The gallery erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Marcus' mother, a petite woman with weary eyes, clutched her chest, her lips trembling as she whispered a prayer. Beside her, Marcus' younger brother Jamal, glaring at the judge, his fists clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "Your Honor, with all due respect," the lawyer stammered. "The surveillance footage proving my client's innocence has not been reviewed." "There. Enough." Whitman's voice boomed, silencing the lawyer. "The evidence is circumstantial. The eyewitness testimony is clear. Marcus Carter is guilty." Marcus shot up from his seat, his voice shaking. "I didn't do it. I wasn't there." "You can't." "Sit down, Mr. Carter," Whitman growled. "Your theatrics will not be tolerated." The gavel struck again, this time punctuating Marcus' despair. The sound felt like a hammer shattering his future into pieces. The gallery's whispers grew louder, a cacophony of disbelief and anger. "Sentencing is as follows," Whitman declared, his expression unflinching. "Marcus Carter, for the crime of armed robbery, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus' mother collapsed into silent sobs, her shoulders shaking. Jamal leapt to his feet. "This is bullsh." "Bailiff!" Whitman shouted. The courtroom security moved swiftly, pulling Jamal away before he could finish. The young boy's voice echoed as he was dragged out. "He didn't do anything. Y'all know he didn't do anything." Marcus sat back down, his legs weak, his voice lost. He stared at the table in front of him, the grain of the wood blurring as tears filled his eyes. He'd known from the beginning that the odds were stacked against him. But this felt like the ultimate betrayal. The system that claimed to seek justice had instead branded him guilty without a fair hearing. "Court is adjourned," Whitman said, his gavel striking one final time. He rose and walked away, unbothered by the lives he had just shattered. Marcus' mother tried to reach for him as he was led out in handcuffs, her cries lost in the chaos. Jamal's words echoed in Marcus' ears as he was escorted down a dark hallway. "This ain't over," Marcus whispered to himself. "It can't be over." Marcus Carter had always been a fighter. Born and raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a low-income neighborhood, life had never handed him anything on a silver platter. The streets were riddled with dangers, gangs, drugs, and a heavy police presence that seemed more interested in intimidation than protection. But Marcus was determined to carve out a different path. At just 23 years old, he had dreams bigger than the cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts of his neighborhood. He wanted to open a community center for at-risk youth, a safe haven where kids could play basketball, get tutoring, or simply feel seen and heard. "They just need someone to believe in them," he'd tell his younger brother Jamal, who often teased Marcus for being too idealistic. But Marcus didn't mind. He knew firsthand how a lack of support could derail a life. His dreams were fueled by a deep sense of responsibility. After their father had walked out years ago, and their mother fell ill, Marcus had stepped up as the head of the household. He worked 2 jobs, one as a delivery driver during the day, and another stocking shelves at a local grocery store at night. The long hours were grueling, but every paycheck went toward keeping the lights on, paying for his mother's medications, and ensuring Jamal and his younger sister Aaliyah had what they needed for school. Life had always been a balancing act, but Marcus had managed. Until now. The day of the crime replayed in Marcus' mind like a bad dream. He had been at home, sitting at the kitchen table, helping Aaliyah with her math homework. Fractions and decimals weren't her strong suit, but Marcus had a knack for breaking things down in a way that made sense to her. He'd been there the whole afternoon, pencil in hand, scribbling equations on scrap paper. Across town, a convenience store had been robbed. The cashier described the perpetrator as a tall black man in his early 20s, wearing a dark hoodie. The description could have fit countless young men in their neighborhood, but it was Marcus who had been singled out. An anonymous tip had led the police to his door later that evening. When the officers arrived, their approach was anything but gentle. Marcus opened the door to find guns drawn, red and blue lights flashing in the night. "Step outside. Hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked. Bewildered, Marcus complied, his heart pounding in his chest as his siblings and mother watched from the living room, their faces etched with fear. "There must be a mistake," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "I didn't do anything." "Save it," the officer snapped, twisting Marcus' arms behind his back to cuff him. "We've got an eyewitness who says otherwise." Marcus' arrest had been a whirlwind of confusion and humiliation. At the station, he tried to explain his alibi, but his words fell on deaf ears. "Sure you were helping your sister," one officer had said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "They all say that." The public defender assigned to his case wasn't much help either. Fresh out of law school, she was juggling dozens of cases and barely had time to glance at Marcus' file before their first court appearance. "Look, I'm doing the best I can," she told him during a rushed meeting in a dimly lit conference room. "But without hard evidence, this is going to be an uphill battle." "There is hard evidence," Marcus insisted. "The surveillance footage from my building will show I never left that day." "Why hasn't anyone looked at it?" "I'll request it," she said. But the weary look in her eyes told Marcus not to hold his breath. The more Marcus thought about it, the clearer it became that the system wasn't just indifferent to his plight. It was actively working against him. From the moment he was arrested, it seemed like every piece of the puzzle was designed to ensure his guilt. The prosecutor painted him as a troublemaker with a record of minor infractions, a fight in high school, a jaywalking ticket, and an unpaid parking fine, twisting these incidents into a narrative that Marcus was a ticking time bomb. Even the judge, Whitman, seemed to relish the opportunity to put another young black man behind bars. Marcus had heard stories about Whitman from other guys in the neighborhood. "If you're black, don't even bother showing up," one had said. "He's already got your sentence written before you walk in." Whitman's reputation wasn't just urban legend. Data showed that he handed down harsher sentences to black defendants compared to their white counterparts for similar crimes. But Marcus' lawyer had dismissed the idea of challenging Whitman's bias, calling it a losing battle. At night, alone in his jail cell, Marcus would close his eyes and try to imagine the life he'd envisioned for himself. The community center, the kids he'd mentor, the pride on his mother's face when he finally achieved something big. But those dreams felt farther away now, buried under layers of despair and systemic injustice. Still, a flicker of hope remained. Jamal had promised to fight for him, swearing he'd find a way to prove Marcus' innocence. "I'll get that footage," Jamal had whispered during a rare visit. "I don't care what it takes." Marcus knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Judge Whitman's veneer of authority and impartiality hides a history steeped in prejudice and entitlement. Born into an affluent family in the Deep South, Whitman's upbringing was marred by supremacist ideologies passed down through generations. His grandfather, a prominent segregationist, and his father, a lawyer notorious for defending discriminatory laws, molded him into a man who saw the world through a distorted lens of privilege and hierarchy. Whitman's education at elite institutions further insulated him, reinforcing his belief in his own superiority and his disdain for those he deemed undeserving. Early in his legal career, whispers of Whitman's biases began to circulate. As a young prosecutor, he was known for disproportionately targeting black defendants. Once on the bench, his sentencing record painted a clear picture. Minorities, especially black men, received harsher sentences compared to their white counterparts for similar crimes. Yet, his meteoric rise through the judicial ranks continued unabated, shielded by powerful connections and a justice system reluctant to police its own. Community activists and investigative journalists have tried to expose Whitman's patterns of injustice. Articles detailing his disproportionate sentencing and court testimonies describing his openly hostile demeanor toward minority defendants have surfaced. But Whitman's network of influential allies always managed to deflect the fallout. Political figures, wealthy donors, and even media moguls rallied behind him, framing any criticism as attacks on a fearless defender of law and order. Marcus' case becomes the latest cog in Whitman's self-serving narrative. To him, Marcus is not a young man with dreams and responsibilities, but a statistic to bolster his reputation as being tough on crime. The evidence of Marcus' innocence is not just ignored, but actively suppressed, with court procedures manipulated to prevent its presentation. Whitman's cold indifference during the trial, cutting off Marcus' lawyer, dismissing evidence requests, isn't new. It's part of a chilling pattern that has destroyed countless lives before Marcus. Meanwhile, Marcus' family and community watch helplessly as the trial unfolds like a pre-written script. His mother, frail from illness, sits in the courtroom, clutching a photograph of her son as a child. His younger siblings, too young to fully grasp the implications, sense the tension and injustice. Community members who know Marcus as a kind, hard-working young man feel their frustration growing with each passing day. Protesters gather outside the courthouse, their signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Stop Judicial Racism." Their chants echo through the courtroom walls, but Whitman remains unmoved, his gavel silencing any hope for fairness. Behind the scenes, a local journalist named Eva Carter begins to dig into Whitman's past. With renewed determination, she uncovers damning details, sealed records of complaints, anonymous accounts of coercion, and connections to white nationalist groups. Eva's investigation paints a picture of a man whose career has been built not on justice, but on maintaining a system designed to oppress. However, her attempts to bring these revelations to light face constant roadblocks. Editors wary of legal repercussions water down her reports. Sources with first-hand knowledge are too afraid to come forward publicly. Whitman's actions in Marcus' case aren't merely about one young man. They're about preserving a legacy of unchecked power. For Whitman, every harsh sentence against a black defendant reinforces the societal order he's dedicated his life to upholding. Marcus, despite his innocence, represents a challenge to that order, and Whitman will stop at nothing to quash it. As the trial progresses, Marcus' family's frustration turns to resolve. His sister, Naomi, a college student studying law, begins organizing the community. She speaks at rallies, coordinates with activists, and uses social media to amplify her brother's story. This isn't just about Marcus, she tells the crowd at one protest. This is about a system that has failed us for generations. Her words resonate, igniting a movement that grows larger with each passing day. Inside the courtroom, Marcus remains stoic but determined. Though he feels the weight of the injustice crushing him, he refuses to let it break his spirit. Every glance at his mother and siblings reminds him why he must fight, not just for his own freedom, but for everyone who has suffered under judges like Whitman. The tension builds as the community's outrage swells, and cracks begin to form in Whitman's carefully constructed facade. Anonymous tips about his misconduct start flooding Eva's inbox. Activists discover inconsistencies in his financial records, hinting at corruption. Even some of Whitman's allies grow uneasy, fearing that his downfall might drag them down with him. As Marcus' sentencing nears, the stakes couldn't be higher. The courtroom becomes a battleground, not just for Marcus' freedom, but for the soul of a community demanding justice. Whitman, sensing the growing opposition, doubles down, determined to make an example of Marcus. But the seeds of resistance have been sown, and the fight is far from over. The gavel had barely struck before news of Marcus' conviction rippled through the community. Outrage swept across the neighborhood like wildfire. Marcus wasn't just any young man. He was one of their own, a beacon of hope, in an environment where hope was often hard to find. His sentencing felt personal, a blatant attack on everything the community stood for. In a matter of hours, activists, community leaders, and Marcus' family rallied, determined to expose the injustice and fight back. By nightfall, the first protest took shape outside the courthouse. It was a sea of voices, united in anger and frustration. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Judicial Racism" were held high as chants echoed through the streets. Naomi, Marcus' sister, became a powerful figure in the movement. Her speeches, raw with emotion and defiance, drew crowds that grew with each passing day. "This is bigger than Marcus," she declared at a rally. "This is about a system that's broken. We won't stop until it's fixed." Among the voices rising against the injustice was Marcus' younger brother, Jamal. At just 17, Jamal's passion and conviction made him an unexpected leader. He took to the stage at protests, delivering fiery speeches that resonated deeply. "They took my brother because they think we're powerless," Jamal shouted into a megaphone at one rally. "But they're wrong. We have a voice, and we'll use it to make them hear us." His voice often trembled, with both rage and the weight of the responsibility he had shouldered. But the community rallied behind him, inspired by his courage. The protests, though initially peaceful, soon drew the ire of the authorities. Police presence at the demonstrations became more aggressive, with officers in riot gear lining the streets. What began as a peaceful march turned chaotic when police moved in to disperse the crowd with tear gas and batons. Despite the violence, the protesters' resolve only strengthened. A defining moment came when a journalist captured an image of Jamal being dragged away in handcuffs, his face contorted with pain and defiance. The image went viral, sparking national outrage and drawing attention to Marcus' case. While the streets buzzed with protests, a dedicated reporter named Eva Carter worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Eva, who had already begun investigating Judge Whitman's record, found herself more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She pored over old case files, interviewed former defendants, and followed a paper trail of financial records that hinted at corruption. Her work revealed a damning pattern. Whitman's disproportionately harsh sentences for black defendants, a suspicious number of dismissed complaints, and financial ties to private prison companies. Eva's findings were explosive, but publishing them was an uphill battle. Editors were hesitant, fearing lawsuits or backlash from Whitman's powerful allies. Undeterred, Eva decided to leverage social media to share her findings. She released a series of articles online, each one more incriminating than the last. The public response was immediate. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #ExposeWhitman began trending, amplifying the community's fight. As the movement gained momentum, alliances formed. Civil rights organizations offered legal aid to Marcus' family. Celebrities and public figures joined the cause, using their platforms to call for justice. Donations poured in to fund the legal battle, giving Marcus' defense team the resources they needed to mount a stronger case. Naomi worked closely with the new lawyers, ensuring that the evidence of Marcus' innocence, particularly the alibi provided by his sister and the unexamined surveillance footage, would finally be brought to light. Amid the chaos, the community found moments of unity and hope. Candlelight vigils were held outside Marcus' prison, with people sharing stories of how he had touched their lives. An elderly neighbor recounted how Marcus had fixed her roof after a storm, refusing to take payment. A young boy tearfully shared how Marcus had mentored him, steering him away from gang involvement. These stories humanized Marcus, turning him from a statistic into a symbol of resilience and injustice. However, the fight was far from over. Whitman, sensing the growing threat to his career, began to retaliate. He publicly dismissed the protests as media-fueled hysteria and accused Eva of slander. He even attempted to expedite Marcus' sentencing, hoping to quash the movement before it could gain more traction. But every move Whitman made only added fuel to the fire. The more he tried to silence the dissent, the louder it grew. The tipping point came when Eva's investigation uncovered a direct link between Whitman and a private prison company. Documents revealed that Whitman had been receiving kickbacks for every inmate sentenced to their facilities. The revelation was a bombshell, exposing not just Whitman's corruption, but also the broader systemic issues that allowed such practices to flourish. The story made national headlines, forcing even Whitman's staunchest allies to distance themselves from him. As the walls began to close in on Whitman, the community's fight entered a new phase. The focus shifted from protesting Marcus' conviction to demanding Whitman's removal from the bench. Petitions circulated, garnering thousands of signatures. Lawmakers, under pressure from their constituents, called for an investigation into Whitman's conduct. For the first time, the scales of power seemed to tilt in favor of justice. In the midst of this whirlwind, Marcus remained behind bars, holding on to hope. Letters from his family and supporters kept his spirits high, reminding him that he was not alone in this fight. He began writing his own letters, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. "I'm not just fighting for myself," he wrote in one letter. "I'm fighting for everyone who's been silenced by this system." The community's fight was far from over, but the cracks in the system were beginning to show. The protests, the investigations, and the growing national attention were proof that change was possible. For Marcus, his family, and everyone who had ever faced injustice, the fight was a testament to the power of unity and resilience. And while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: they would not stop until justice was served. The clang of the prison gates echoed in Marcus' ears, a harsh reminder of the harsh reality he now faced. As he was led through the dimly lit corridors, the smell of bleach and despair hung heavy in the air. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. He had been wrongfully convicted, but to the guards and inmates, he was just another number, another body to fill the overcrowded cells. Marcus quickly learned that the prison system was as oppressive as the courtroom that had sentenced him. The guards seemed to take pleasure in exerting their authority. Some barked orders with a sneer. Others turned a blind eye to blatant injustices among inmates. Food was scarce and barely edible, and the constant noise of shouting, banging, and the occasional fight made sleep elusive. The other inmates were a mix of hardened criminals and unfortunate souls like Marcus, men swept up in a system that didn't care about their innocence or humanity. Early on, Marcus was warned by a cellmate to stay out of trouble. "Don't trust anyone," the man muttered, eyes darting nervously around the cell block. "Keep your head down and maybe you'll survive." In the solitude of his cell, Marcus found a lifeline in writing. The prison provided scraps of paper and blunt pencils, and he used them to pen letters to his family. He poured out his fears, his anger, and his determination to prove his innocence. Writing became a form of resistance, a way to keep his mind sharp and his hope alive. "Dear Mom," he began one letter, "I think about you and the kids every day. I know Jamal is fighting for me out there, and I need you to know I'm fighting in here. This place is designed to break us, but they won't break me. I promise I'll come back to you." Marcus' letters became a source of strength, not just for himself, but for his family. His mother read them aloud to Jamal and his siblings, reminding them of Marcus' resilience. "He's strong," she would say, "and so are we." Not everyone in the prison was an enemy. One day, during yard time, Marcus met an older inmate named Raymond, a former lawyer who had been wrongfully convicted of embezzlement. Raymond had spent years studying the law from behind bars. "I've seen your type before," Raymond said, squinting at Marcus, with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "Young, smart, and railroaded by a system that's rigged against you." At first, Marcus was skeptical of Raymond's offer to help, but as the days turned into weeks, he began to see the older man as an ally. Raymond shared legal advice and helped Marcus draft an appeal. He taught him the importance of persistence and how to navigate the complex web of legal procedures. "They count on you giving up," Raymond said one evening, as they sat in the corner of the library. "Don't give them that satisfaction. Every letter you write, every motion you file, it's a step closer to freedom, despite the relentless challenges." Marcus refused to let the system strip him of his humanity. He began to mentor younger inmates, sharing his story and encouraging them to fight for their futures. "This place doesn't define you," he told a teenager who had been incarcerated for a petty crime. "You're more than a number. Don't let them take away your dignity." Through these small acts of kindness, Marcus found a sense of purpose. He realized that even in the darkest of places, he could be a light for others. His resolve only strengthened his determination to clear his name and return to his family. One day, Marcus received a letter from Jamal. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were filled with hope. "We've got a journalist digging into your case," Jamal wrote. "She's found something about Whitman, something big. Hold on, Marcus. We're going to get you out of there." Marcus clutched the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. His family, his community, and even unlikely allies were standing with him. As the days went on, Marcus focused on the appeal with renewed vigor. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew he had something the system couldn't take away: his unyielding spirit. The chapter closed with Marcus staring out of his cell window, the faint light of dawn breaking through the darkness. It was a reminder that no matter how long the night, the sun would rise again. He whispered to himself, "I'll make it out of here. I have to." The reporter, Sarah, sat in her dimly lit office. She pored over countless documents tied to Judge Whitman's career. Months of relentless digging had led her to a breakthrough: a surveillance tape from the day of the robbery. It had never been presented in court. The footage, obtained through a public records request, showed Marcus at his sister's apartment building during the time of the alleged crime. Her hands trembled as she hit play again, ensuring she hadn't missed a detail. There was no doubt Marcus had an alibi. Sarah's discovery didn't stop there. Buried in court filings and leaked emails, she found evidence of Whitman's deep ties to powerful figures with vested interests in his judicial reign. These documents painted a damning picture: a man who traded justice for political favors and operated with impunity. Sarah knew this could be the story of a lifetime, but one that came with enormous risks. The next morning, Sarah published her findings. The article, "Injustice Exposed: The Case Against Judge Whitman," spread like wildfire. News outlets across the country picked up the story. The hashtag #FreeMarcus began trending on social media. Civil rights groups, including the NAACP and ACLU, rallied to Marcus' cause, demanding his case be reopened. Protests swelled as more people joined the movement. Marcus' family, especially his brother Jamal, became prominent voices, delivering impassioned speeches that ignited the crowd. "This isn't just about my brother," Jamal declared, his voice amplified by a sea of microphones. "This is about every black man and woman who's been silenced and crushed by a system built against us." Fueled by the new evidence, a coalition of civil rights attorneys filed an emergency motion. The motion cited the surveillance footage and evidence of corruption. Hope blossomed that justice might finally prevail. The revelation sent shockwaves through Whitman's world. For decades, he had operated with impunity, shielded by a network of allies. Now, with his name plastered across headlines and protesters chanting outside his home, he felt the weight of scrutiny for the first time. Whitman scrambled to suppress the evidence. He called in favors, pressured his powerful connections. He tried to discredit Sarah and the activists. Anonymous threats flooded Sarah's inbox, warnings to back off. But Sarah, undeterred, doubled down. She gave interviews and released more documents, keeping the public's attention on the case. In a desperate move, Whitman met with the district attorney. He urged them to dismiss the new evidence as inadmissible. When that failed, he resorted to more sinister tactics. Marcus' family reported strange cars outside their home. Jamal received anonymous calls, threats of harm if the protests didn't stop. Despite the mounting pressure, the community refused to back down. The protests grew louder and more organized. Celebrities and politicians voiced their support. Donations poured in to fund Marcus' legal defense. Local churches opened their doors for strategy meetings. The tide was turning. A key moment came when retired judges spoke out. They publicly condemned Whitman's actions. They called for an independent review of his rulings. This bold move emboldened the legal community. Demanding accountability, Whitman faced even greater scrutiny. From behind bars, Marcus' voice emerged as a symbol of resilience. Handwritten letters were smuggled out of prison. He addressed the protesters, thanking them for their support. "Your fight gives me hope," one letter read. "Not just for my freedom, but for a world where justice isn't a privilege." His words were read aloud at rallies, bringing tears to the eyes of many. One particularly moving letter described his dream, a dream of opening a community center, to give young people opportunities he never had. "Even in here," he wrote, "I dream, and I won't stop dreaming until we're all free." The evidence against Whitman and in favor of Marcus was undeniable. Under public pressure, the state's attorney general announced a formal investigation into Whitman's conduct. A date was set for a hearing to determine whether Marcus' conviction should be overturned. In the days leading up to the hearing, the community's energy was electric. Marcus' family prepared to speak in court, determined to make their voices heard. Sarah continued her relentless reporting, keeping the spotlight on the case. Whitman, cornered and isolated, faced the unraveling of his career. As the hearing approached, one thing was clear. This was no longer just about Marcus. It was about dismantling a system that had enabled injustice for far too long. The world watched, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. The morning of Marcus' reopened trial dawned with a heaviness in the air. It seemed to press down on everyone in the city. The courthouse, once a symbol of power, now felt like an arena where justice and injustice would battle for dominion. But this time, the odds were different. A team of high-profile lawyers had stepped in to represent Marcus. They rallied behind him with unwavering conviction. They were determined to expose the rot at the heart of the justice system and to vindicate Marcus, whose name had been smeared by a biased judge. As Marcus entered the courtroom, his eyes met those of his family. They sat in the front row, their expressions a blend of hope and worry. His mother, who had spent sleepless nights pacing the kitchen, now sat with her head held high. His younger brother, Jamal, clenched his fists, his jaw set in defiance. The community that had fought for Marcus outside the courthouse was now silent inside. Their presence was a collective breath held in anticipation. Whitman entered moments later. His gait was unsteady, and the stoic mask he had worn for so long began to crack. His eyes flared with anger as he took his seat. He glanced at Marcus with a venomous sneer. But this time, Marcus refused to look away. This was no longer a court of quiet intimidation. The air was thick with determination. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Marcus' lawyers, led by the tenacious Mia Patel, made their case clear. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we are here today not just to prove Marcus' innocence, but to show how deeply the roots of corruption can entwine with the very foundations of justice." The room buzzed with whispers as Mia laid out the evidence. Documents revealed Whitman's financial ties to powerful figures. Notes hinted at secret meetings. And surveillance footage would shatter the illusion of Marcus' guilt. The footage, captured by a nearby store's security camera, clearly showed Marcus at home. He was helping Jamal with his homework while the robbery was taking place blocks away. The evidence was damning, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. When the footage played, gasps rippled through the gallery. Marcus' mother covered her mouth in disbelief, her tears falling. The footage showed Marcus' calm demeanor, his focus on his brother, unaware of the chaos elsewhere. A murmur spread as the footage ended, a mixture of relief and anger. Mia turned to the judge, her eyes locked onto Whitman's. "This video proves that Marcus had no part in the robbery," she said. "The real evidence of guilt was fabricated, manipulated, and suppressed to maintain an illusion of control. Your Honor, we ask that the court see the truth that was hidden." Whitman shifted in his seat, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced at the jury, desperate to maintain some semblance of authority. But his once imposing stature began to look fragile. The prosecution, which had always been on Whitman's side, seemed to have lost its fervor. Their case crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. Their arguments were reduced to half-hearted objections. But it wasn't just the surveillance footage. Mia's team had more evidence. Testimonies from witnesses, too afraid to speak before, now emboldened by the tide of change. One witness, a former clerk at the courthouse, testified about seeing Whitman receive large, untraceable payments. He recalled the whispers of the judge's connections to underworld figures. Rumors spread of his influence used to silence dissenting voices. As Whitman's downfall unfolded, his composure slipped further. His hand trembled as he adjusted the papers in front of him. His face contorted into a scowl of frustration. "This is preposterous," he barked, trying to regain control. The sound of his voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate. Mia's voice cut through the chaos. "Your Honor, I implore you to consider the weight of justice and fairness. This trial has not been about truth until now. The people deserve better." The room erupted as Whitman's outburst exposed him. He stood abruptly, slamming his gavel so hard it splintered the wood beneath it. "I will not be made a mockery of," he shouted, wild with fury. He pointed at Marcus. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game far bigger than you understand." Marcus' heart pounded, but he stood taller than ever before. This was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about dismantling the system that had sought to crush him. Jamal's eyes met Marcus. A silent promise exchanged between brothers. Justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was a tangible force, one they would not let be denied. The jury began to deliberate. The room was charged with anticipation. Whitman sat rigidly, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. The hours stretched on as voices in the jury room rose and fell. Their deliberation tested the strength they'd been given to fight against centuries of inequality. Finally, the doors creaked open, and the jury emerged. The foreperson, a woman with tired eyes, met Marcus' gaze and nodded. "We have reached a verdict," she said, her voice steady. "We the jury find the defendant, Marcus Reed, not guilty." The words echoed in the silence, a powerful anthem of redemption. Marcus fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The weight of freedom crushed down on him. His family surged forward, enveloping him in an embrace that spoke of unconditional love and victory. The room was no longer cold and suffocating. It was a place where truth had triumphed over power, and hope had been restored. Whitman was escorted out in handcuffs. The once feared judge now reduced to a man shackled by his own sins. As Marcus stood, the community erupted in cheers, chants, and applause, their voices a crescendo of triumph. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The battle for true justice was far from over. But today, he had taken his first step toward change, and he would not walk it alone. The courtroom was packed. A buzz of anticipation hung in the air like smoke before a storm. Marcus sat at the front, flanked by his legal team. Each member's face was set with a determination that mirrored his own. The once imposing figure of Judge Whitman stood in the center of the room. His composure was cracked and flustered. His suit, once tailored to perfection, now hung loosely around him. This was a man who had built his power on the suffering of others. And now, that power was slipping like sand through his fingers. Whitman's arrest was the culmination of months of tireless work, protests, investigations, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It was a testament to Marcus, his family, and the community that had rallied behind him. The news had spread like wildfire. Whitman, caught not just for his biased rulings, but for a web of corruption, bribery, evidence tampering, and the abuse of power. The once untouchable judge was now shackled, awaiting trial for crimes that had upended countless lives. As the judge's arraignment was broadcast, Marcus's phone buzzed. Messages of congratulations and support flooded in. Yet, none of the texts or calls could compare to the sensation of freedom coursing through his veins. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of injustice begin to lift. But Marcus was no longer the man he once was. Prison had tested his spirit, pushed him to the brink, and made him question everything. It had also taught him the unyielding power of hope. Days after his release, Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Jamal, now older and more confident, and their mother, her eyes glistening with tears. The community center he had always dreamed of was finally within reach. No longer a mere vision, but an imminent reality. "This is for every young person who's been told they don't matter," Marcus said, his voice steady and strong. "This is for every family that struggled, for every person who fought when the odds were stacked against them." The community erupted in cheers. They knew Marcus's fight was not just his own. It was theirs. A shared battle for dignity, equality, and justice. The opening of the community center was celebrated with an event. People from every background came together. Old and young, black and white, activists and skeptics. It was a mosaic of the city's past and future, a testament to what could be achieved when the will to resist was stronger than the forces that sought to suppress. As Marcus prepared to cut the ribbon, he glanced over at Jamal. Jamal stood beside him with his head held high. Jamal had found his voice during the protests, speaking truths that many in power had tried to silence. "I never thought we'd make it to this day," Jamal whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But we did, Marcus. We did." Marcus placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We didn't just make it, Jamal. We changed everything." The ribbon fell. The crowd, which had waited so long, surged forward with joy, breaking into cheers. The building behind them, once just bricks and mortar, became a beacon of what resilience could achieve. The community center was more than a building. It was a promise fulfilled, a promise that no one would be forgotten, that justice was worth fighting for, and that change was possible, even in the face of daunting odds. But as the celebration continued, Marcus felt a pang in his chest. While Whitman's fall marked a victory, the echoes of injustice still lingered. His time in prison had shown him how deep the roots of systemic racism went. Whitman had been one man, but the system that protected him was vast and entrenched. "We're just getting started," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. He knew that for every Whitman who fell, there were more who thrived, hidden behind veils of power and privilege. Marcus vowed to use his voice and platform to push for reform. He would speak out, not just for himself but for the countless others who still languished in prison, wrongfully accused or unjustly sentenced. That night, as Marcus looked out at the city, he saw the stars above, glimmering as if whispering promises of hope. He knew the fight wasn't over. It had only begun. But Marcus was no longer the man he once was. He was a force, and he would never stop fighting for justice. And as the city slept under the cloak of darkness, somewhere in the world, Whitman sat behind bars. No longer a symbol of fear, but a cautionary tale. The story of Marcus was not just one of resilience. It was a call to action, proof that justice could prevail, not by waiting, but by standing up and demanding it, no matter the cost. The crowd at the community center carried that truth forward. Marcus's voice echoed in the night. "We fight not just for what's right, but for what's possible." And that was just the beginning.